For some Lutherans, the antipathy to the concept of worldview derives from a suspicion that worldview thinking very easily becomes ideological thinking, which fails fully to recognize just how darkly we now see through the glass, and which often reveals an unhelpful tendency to ignore or suppress or distort evidence which might otherwise unsettle tidily constructed systems. For others, though, the discomfort comes not so much from the concept of worldview in itself, but simply from the claim that there might be a distinctly Lutheran one. And the fear here is that such a claim might betray an unwarranted sectarianism. Because to the extent that Lutherans have a comprehensive and cohesive philosophy or worldview, it's simply that of the universal small c Catholic Church. With that disclaimer on the table, however, it certainly is possible to speak of some emphases within the Lutheran tradition and within its theology which are more or less distinctive, and which do in fact tend to shape approaches to both life and learning. And the most succinct entree into these emphases is perhaps the introduction to that work which Luther himself described as presenting the whole of Christian life in brief form, his 1520 treatise on Christian liberty. There he famously set forth as his subject matter the ostensibly contradictory theses: a Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. These two sentences perhaps best illustrate that to which my subtitle refers in speaking of paradox as paradigmatic for the Lutheran mind. Now, to be sure, the acknowledgement and even embrace of paradox is not, of course, unique to Lutheran Christianity. Pascal, for instance, famously highlights in his Pensees the paradox that is man himself. Judge of all things, feeble earthworm. Repository of truth, sink of doubt and error. The glory and the refuse of the universe, whose very greatness comes from knowing that he's wretched. And just as famously, the similarly Catholic G.K. Chesterton devotes a chapter to the paradoxes of Christianity in his classic Orthodoxy, in which he emphasizes the very same. But moreover, no Christian who, as a Christian, confesses with the creeds that God is three and yet one, and that our Savior is fully human and yet fully divine, can escape entanglement with the inherent paradoxes at the very center of the Christian faith. And yet it remains true that Lutheran theology, in light of these shared creeds and confessions, has perhaps more than others treated paradox as, in some sense, paradigmatic. So, for example, Lutherans especially emphasize the Christian status as simul justus et peccator, simultaneously a saint and a sinner. With regard to the sacrament of the altar, as with the doctrine of the Incarnation, it is affirmed by Lutherans that the finite can indeed contain the infinite, that Christ with his body and his blood are truly present under the mundane forms of bread and wine. Perhaps most importantly for grasping a Lutheran view of life and learning, though, is an understanding of the intertwined paradoxes of God's two words, law and gospel, God's two kingdoms, and the Christian's two kinds of righteousness. I'll flesh out these categories, their import and their implications in just a moment, but one or two caveats are worth inserting before we proceed. And the first is simply that through the 20th century, the understanding of Lutheranism's paradoxical nature has been very much informed and very often misinformed by H. Richard Niebuhr's seminal work, Christ and Culture. There he treats Luther's thought, and it should be noted that of St. Paul, under the category of Christ and culture in paradox. And while I've consciously chosen to retain Niebuhr's familiar terminology, the case can be made that many of the emphases which inform it are not, strictly speaking, paradoxical at all. Just as there's no real or even apparent contradiction in a father both doting on as well as disciplining his child, neither is there in God speaking to his own children in two different voices, that of the law and that of the gospel, or in the Christians living simultaneously in view of two different ends, the temporal and the eternal. And the import of this is especially key in light of Niebuhr's further association of paradox with a kind of dualism, with a radical separation between, for example, the secular and the sacred, or the realms of creation and redemption. Properly understood, the Lutheran paradigm simply makes distinctions rather than positing strict dichotomies. And properly understanding this both-and emphasis further allows us to avoid any notion of Lutheranism's fetishizing paradox simply for the sake of paradox, or, as some would charge, reveling in irrationality.